cheers. And
Yeah, that's pretty.
how do I pronounce your name?
Yeah.
Okay, cheers. Opening up, STRATHCLYDE.
Stephen first and
Alright, cheers.
Joseph and EUDC.
Okay, cheers. Closing up, SHEFFIELD.
I'm first and we're both here all day.
Okay, awesome. And Belgrade B, closing up.
Stefan, I don't mind with you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any questions before we get started? Oh, yeah, I could double check, thanks. Alright, the motion before this House is this House believes that EU member states should nationalize all their oil and gas resources and operations in order to surrender total ownership and control of them to an EU-run energy agency. It's my pleasure to welcome the Prime Minister.
Thank you for the floor, Mr. Speaker. During the speech, I'm going to explain three things. First of all, I'm going to outline our mechanism. Secondly, I'm going to say why oil is money and money is power and why that is a good thing to be held in the hands of the EU. And thirdly, we're going to say how this improves A, domestic interests for all EU states, and B, international interests. Right. First of all, the mechanism. Basically, the EU Commission, which is probably the most independent and issue-based arm of the EU, is going to set up an independent committee which will oversee this. Right. That committee will be a committee of experts who know best how to do this. We're going to try and have as much done at the state level as possible, right? So states are still going to be in control of employing people, how this is refined and all of that stuff, right? There's only going to be three differences as a result of this policy once it is nationalised and then amalgamated at the EU level, right? First of all, we're going to have a precise common external tariff with regards to the sale of oil. Secondly, we're going to have more stringent common environmental policies as to how this oil is refined and so on. And thirdly and finally, we are going to have, the EU will be able to decide at a supranational level through obviously debate and discussion, etc., who you cannot sell to. Not picking the people that you sell to, but picking people that you cannot. We think this is incredibly important, right? Any clarifications? Cool. No, right. So, how oil is money and how money is power, right? We believe that, from a very realistic, neo-realist standpoint, right, that money translates into power. Oil is, of course, money because oil is a finite commodity that everyone is dependent on and that only certain states can produce and can extract because only certain states have that natural advantage of having it in their landmass. This means that they have, not a monopoly, but a market advantage that comes through being in that unique position of being able to sell it. Therefore, that's why we can see that oil can be much more priced than other natural resources and therefore can translate into money. How does money translate into power? First of all, obviously through the direct mechanism of you can spend it on military expenditure, but more importantly, two things. First of all, money can be translated to, no thank you, right? Money can be translated to the ability to impose economic sanctions, to restrict trade and commerce, to restrict economic interaction with other states, and that is a punishment. Oh, sure.
Who is going to get the money? How will you that money that you're going to raise?
Oh, it's still going to be distributed reasonably to the people who are employed and stuff like that. But some money, of course, will have to be subsumed into the administration of this policy and the EU and the arm that governs it, right? This isn't about making more money for the EU. This is about having more bargaining power for the EU, right? So about how money is power. So you can economically punish other states. So that is more power. But also when you go into negotiations with other states or other international actors from the offset, if you have more cash, you have more bargaining power, you are perceived to be someone who is more worth dealing with. So in terms of reputation, that's more important too. We think that individual EU states are no longer at the point where they can become world players on the world stage. Britain, as much as we would love to, are not the leaders of the world anymore. But as when you assemble that critical mass, the EU as a group, has the biggest GDP in the world. The EU as a group has power that none of its member states can have on its own. That is why it's in the interest of all these states to enter into this, right? Because they will attain the level of power that they couldn't do otherwise. Then you can compete with the likes of the US and the Middle East and so on. Which brings me on to my third point. Right, sure.
Even if, and you're claiming that oil wealth and gas wealth will be promoted more equally, do you
do not think it's important if your policy creates a world where there is less oil and gas revenue within the EU.
Okay, so we think, given the massive benefits on our side, if that was true, that probably isn't the thing that we need, because the EU isn't generally cash-strapped, even if it feels that way a little bit in the moment. But, like, moreover, we think that because of the high price that you can charge for oil, it's always going to be a profitable industry. Right, so in terms of how this improves domestic interests, two ways. First of all, it improves energy security. Energy security is a genuine concern for all states across the world currently because of the fact that other technologies have not caught up yet. And obviously we all need energy to have like a remotely comfortable standard of living. So like energy security is something that's constantly like to be concerned about on the same level of like food security, right? Energy security is within that category. We think that's good for states. But secondly, in terms of like environmental sustainability, we think having a greater level of regulation because of this amalgamation is a good thing that will benefit states in the long run, particularly states who are perhaps new to the area of like oil and gas refinement, so don't have as much experience in how to best practice this, particularly on like how we can have research at a greater level on a collective level in terms of things like fracking and stuff, where the consequences aren't as well known and well outlined yet. Right. Secondly, in terms of international interests, several things on this. First of all, it makes us less dependent on players like the USA and the Middle East. The USA, right? As much as they are generally our friends, the USA, particularly with energy policy, has a habit of being isolationist. So as a result, it's good for us to not be dependent on them. The Middle East has often been an outline of our ideological desires, so that's problematic. But moreover, like the Middle East has a habit of like doing the OPEC thing, right? Where they cartelize and they massively overwrite the price above what we would like to pay. So we get out of that problem. Right. Secondly, international interests. We protect the interests of our Eastern European members or possible future members, right? This is incredibly important given the Ukrainian situation, right? Because we allow them to not be bullied by Russia anymore, who have this overarching ability to this overarching ability at the moment to intimidate them and bully them with the idea that we will not give you oil and gas anymore. If we have a greater level of oil and gas that we can provide those states with, that is no longer possible. We think that's good, given the habit that Russia uses that as a tool by which they can assert themselves and impinge on the sovereignty of other states, which we are of course against, right? Hence why we're punishing them at the moment. And finally, because we have more bargaining power as a collective, and this is really what we are pushing with our case as to why individual state interests or sovereignty are simply just not as important, right? We have more collective bargaining power because we've achieved a critical mass by the number of us, and we think it is incredibly important in the world in which we live for individual EU states don't have to be self-sufficient, but the EU collective does have to be self-sufficient, because at the end of the day, there is no overarching international authority that can bail you out, that can protect you when things go wrong. You may have friends, but they're only friends for as long as it is convenient. There is no one who is beholden. There is no one who will absolutely, definitely save you when things go wrong. As such, you always have to have the ability to save yourself. That's why energy security is a thing, and that's why, wanting to achieve power is a thing that we would admire. So what do we tell you? We tell you that first of all, oil translates to cash, and cash translates to power. Clean is going to tell you more about why that power being in the hands of the EU as opposed to individual states is a good thing in terms of what the EU is and does. And secondly, we tell you that this is better in terms of the EU's domestic interests, but more importantly, its foreign interests. We're very happy to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech, and now we welcome the leader of the opposition.
Mr. Speaker, let me be clear from the start. Oil and gas is the global concern that will shape the political landscape for the next 50 years at least. We think it is an emotive topic. It is a topic which countries are fearful of. It is a topic which dictates national elections, and it is a topic which is so close and so powerful in these countries. This speech is going to focus mainly on two things. We're going to focus on the distribution of resources within the EU itself, and we're also going to talk about how this jeopardises the future of the EU as an institution. Okay, but first, most of the rebuttal will be integrated, but one miscellaneous point that we're going to talk about first. When the Prime Minister stands up and says that we're going to be less reliant on countries like the USA and like Russia, that was only contingent on the government bench proving that we can in some way increase production of oil within the EU itself. When we cannot, when we are a net importer of oil on gas from countries like Russia, like Angola, like Algeria, we are reliant still on those countries in terms of the policies which they prove, which in terms of the amount of oil and gas that they can provide to us. Not now. Okay. Right, on to the first point. How this is the EU and the distribution of resources. The EU is an institution which has powerful political imbalances inherent to it. Okay? There are countries such as Germany, such as the United Kingdom, who are disproportionately powerful in the network of allegiances within the EU. These are countries who have a political incentive to ensure the best terms for their own governments, aside from an EU level. Why is this? Because energy policy has dictated every major election in a European country at a national level over the last 4 years. This means that these politicians are first and most beholden to their own citizens of their own country, who will vote primarily on energy issues that they see as affecting them. If these politicians were to go to the EU and to receive an unfavourable deal in terms of energy usage or energy distribution of resources, it would have massive political ramifications for them in a home environment. Not now. Therefore, the countries such as Germany, such as the UK, are massively incentivised to make use of their powerful stature and powerful imbalance, the power imbalance that they hold within the EU, to ensure that the allocation of resources is in their favour. Much in the way that Germany's control of the central bank has been led to to an imbalance of the euro leaning closely towards markets such as the German market. We think that that imbalance will also lead to. It will lead to the oil being balanced in that way as well. Okay, so even in the sense that when they stand up and say that there's going to be an independent body who are going to oversee this, we see that they are still a body appointed by politicians who actively operate in the political sphere, who are still people who have elevated themselves to the position of being appointed by an EU committee, who still have political interests, who still will want jobs after this, who still are beholden to leaders of certain countries more than others, and we say that they are typically the leaders of countries like Germany, like the UK. Okay, so why is all of this important, right? It's important because the countries who are not in this power composite in the middle of the EU, the smaller countries have no option to social an alternative when they are the victim of this disproportionate allocation of resources. Okay, so what happens there is that they cannot now, because everything is centralised, and the condition of their EU membership is that they comply with this centralised allocation of resources. They cannot use market forces to obtain a better deal for themselves in any sort of situation. Okay, why is this really, really bad? This stunts the growth of these countries who we worry about the most, because they are the smaller EU countries, the countries which the fundamental tenet of the EU was to provide things like prosperity, to provide an increased opportunity for them to compete on an international scale. Before I move on, Adam.
EDF currently own all the energy infrastructure in France and most of the UK and Germany and many of these smaller countries. What's this competition you're talking about?
The competition is for sourcing oil and sourcing. If you have to purchase oil from the countries which the EU policy has dictated the terms on, there are options. You can purchase liquefied natural gas from the United States, or you can purchase it from Angola. If the EU centralised policy dictates that you'll purchase it from the USA, you could arrange some sort of national deal with Angola, which puts you on preferential terms with them, which you could do, but not if you're having to adhere to centralised EU pricing mechanisms. Okay, so we say that these countries are not free to source alternative resources, not now. So their economies are naturally going to be stunted. Why is this? Because these countries rely on energy to improve their economies. Energy is the sole focus of how a country improves its economy. It's every piece of infrastructure, every piece of construction, everything relies on energy. These countries need to be reactive, not now, to the needs of the energy of the people within their country. There are no pricing signals, no proper market feedback that is relative to these countries that they can access whenever the resources and the control of the operations and resources are centralised. Okay, they are reliant on policy and pricing mechanisms and forecasting that's done at a central level by countries like Germany and like the UK. These countries cannot control and cannot be manoeuvrable enough with their own economies to respond to the needs that they have right now. The countries, smaller countries in the EU are not like Germany, they are not like the UK, they have different energy needs, they have different infrastructural needs, and it's important that those are being able to be met. That can be met when they have the freedom to move and the freedom to take deals on their terms, not when they're subject to pricing mechanisms and pricing control by a centralised body. Okay, moving on. Why this jeopardises the future of the EU as an institution. This is really important. See everything I said in my rhetoric at the start about the emotive power of energy. You have now just politicised the entire distribution of energy to a degree which it is nowhere near as politicised now. Why is this? Because any failure, any lights out over some country, any massive energy problem is now the fault of the EU central body, because they are the people who are in control of this energy. It is their fault, okay? So why is this like a problem? It's a massive problem because we rely on buy-in from smaller countries who are perhaps like on the rise rather than have massive sway within the EU. We rely on them buying into the EU, and we say that the situations in countries are supported when these countries, when they develop things like human rights, when they buy into like criminal, the justice system within the EU, when they buy into policies which may initially harm them because they're not positive for their economy, but we think it's important that they buy into them. When they are being like screwed over by a central EU committee on something which is so important, it's so emotive to them at a national level for their elections and for the safety of their citizens, we say you are far less likely to get these countries to buy into this important legislation. They are also now more incentivised to leave the EU if the situation becomes bad enough. Because if there are literally lights out in their country, if there is this massive shortage of energy, which is like hampering development, hampering infrastructure, and if the local governments can say we're not getting this done because it's an EU problem, then there is a massive incentive, given the importance of energy, for them to leave the EU. If not leaving the EU, to move towards countries who are able to offer them terms like that are more on their favour. So we say that therefore you lose all the positive benefits of like what the EU initially stands for, to provide prosperity and to provide a safe environment for these countries. They move towards countries who see a weakness and are able to exploit that. Mr. Speaker, we think oil and gas is hugely emotive. We think it's a massive issue. We want smaller countries to get a good deal out of this. We want the EU to stay a stable organisation. We are so proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. We continue with the Deputy Prime Minister.
Like, note everything essentially that opening opposition say is also an argument against milk quotas which we have, agricultural production quotas which we have, anything that essentially relies on the EU integrating economically. So essentially their argument is no longer have an EU that is economically interdependent, or no longer have an EU. We don't think that flies. 2 points in extending the case for proposition. Number one, I'm going to talk about economic interdependency and how you reduce the disparity between oil-rich countries and like agricultural-rich countries, why it's better for the EU. And number two, I'm going to talk about like economic interdependency, why it's totally consistent with everything the EU already does and in fact betters it. First of all, a couple of points of rebuttal, right? Like, number one, we say that like countries that currently don't produce oil, even if it is the case that they are still dependent on other countries to produce oil for them, they are now dependent on countries who do not have a reason to screw them over as much as possible. Number one, even if it's just the case that we share the same currency as them, therefore there's no reason for us to want their country to fail massively. But even so, we say by nature of the fact that the EU is supranational to the extent that it is, we already get better oversight, for example. We get better technology, we get better market research. It may be the case that we can maximise oil production within the EU, so we don't see what their problem is. Number two, okay, we say then they tell us that if a German politician has to go back to Germany with an unfavourable political deal, then that would be really bad for some reasons they don't really articulate. See the fact that that's true of everything the EU does, right? If Merkel has to return, no thank you. No, yes, okay. If Merkel has to return from a political meeting whereby she hasn't secured something that is in German strategic interest, that is something that happens all the time. The idea is that the nature of the EU is to compromise, to give you some things that you want and some things that you don't, okay? Not a problem, that happens all the time. Number three, okay? They say that small countries could make a preferential deal with Angola. See the fact that Helen never said we'd be telling you who you had to source it from. What we said is, now you will be more likely to source it from the EU because it will be in your strategic benefit. And what we're going to do is prevent you from selling to certain people. That's totally different, so that entire half of his speech falls automatically. But even more so, if it were true that we were saying that, which we didn't, it is intuitively obvious that it would be better for you to source from the EU, even if that it's just closer to you, therefore it requires less costs and infrastructure and that kind of thing. But number two, because again they are less likely to screw you over in terms of price, because if your country fails, then we all fail, because that's how the EU works, right? And finally, okay, we say that we still have market feedback because the oil, the US and the Middle East are still selling oil, right? So we can still cross-reference those market prices. we don't really see like how that makes any difference. We just have fewer markets to reference, again, just to make a difference, okay? Economic independency, okay? Why is this consistent with EU policy so far? Because as far as we can see, what's coming out of OP is that like this is an unjustifiable loss of sovereignty when you, like, to countries who sign up to the EU. See the fact that what you do when you join the EU is that you pool your sovereignty. You take the power that you have as individual states, disparate as they are, and you pull them together for the benefit of the whole. And we see that this works in a couple of ways. See the fact that, for example, the EU can currently compel you to do things that you may not think is in your short-term interest, but it's more than likely in your long-term interest. See the fact that it can force you to take like economic migrants into your country and give them work. It can force you to take them into your country and give them social welfare. It can force you to take students into your country and give them loans, right? It can force you, for example, to change your constitutional law by reason of a directive or an ECJ judgment. No, thank you. So we say that really what they're saying, they are just giving you arguments why the EU shouldn't be a thing. That's not the debate, right? We're assuming that the EU is probably a good thing. If so, they haven't given us any reasons why it's not, right? Why is it in the state's interest to pull your interest in this way, right? Number one, smaller states which they're interested in. Usually smaller states are not the power players that we're talking about. That means that they currently lose out under the status quo, whereby countries like the US and like Angola can dictate prices to them, and there's nothing we can do. I think it's even more damaging when you look at examples like Russia, who can effectively dictate to our new Eastern European EU countries what the prices at which they buy are on. And we think that's really damaging, right? So smaller countries, even though they are bad under the status quo, are marginally better under ours, because it's more likely than not that they will get preferential prices, right? Because again, we don't have an incentive to screw them over. Number two, bigger states also benefit from being part of a bigger federation. See the fact that we have in the EU the second largest nominal GDP. However, we have a massively disparate, disparation of power between, say, the US and the EU, because the US has control of all of its assets and the EU doesn't. So while collectively we have almost as much money as they do, we don't have control over all that money, whereas the US does. That means that we can never, no thank you, be as powerful as they are. We think that if we want to survive as a federation of states, that this is a great way to take the kind of power that Helen talks about and use it in that way. I'll take a POI. Yeah, go ahead.
The United Kingdom, which includes Scotland, is one of the biggest oil producers. Given right now it has to deal with Nigel Farage, who says we should leave the EU because it's not in our interest, and Scotland, which is trying to guarantee will get its oil revenue in order to stop us from going independent. What do you reckon the UK's political incentive to stay in the EU is?
I think currently the UK might not have much of a political incentive to stay in the EU. However, they do so for a couple of reasons. They do so because they realise that it is more important strategically to be inside the EU than it is to be outside of the EU. Equally, they know that we can give them preferential deals on stuff like manufacturing and stuff like agriculture, which is what I'm going to talk about now, right? The problem is, number two, economic independency. How it's illusory unless you take the larger powers in the economic forum and make people collectivise them too, okay? Because the EU currently has control of your economy if you're within the EU to a huge degree, right? Not only the stuff I've already talked about, but equally the EU can tell you when you can and cannot produce agricultural produce, right? It tells you how much milk you can produce in a year. It tells you how much you can export and import and at what cost, right? So the problem is if we're going to divide the EU into two types of country, which obviously is false, but we're going to deal with it for the sake of the debate because it's helpful, okay? Think of large countries not like Germany, who may not be oil producers, or as oil-rich countries which can effectively at the moment dictate the cost of which and the price of which other people buy them. And then there are smaller countries, places like Portugal and Ireland, which are massively dependent on their agricultural sectors, right? The problem is those countries lose out under the status quo because we tell them when they can and cannot produce the things that are important to them, and we tell oil-rich countries that because they are richer, we cannot tell them when and when not to produce their resources, right? That's totally inconsistent, particularly when taking into account that agricultural sectors are far more relatively poor than other countries, even if we are still all better together. So the problem is at the point at which you are able to tell some countries when and when not to produce their resources, and you cannot tell the richer countries who could help us all when to, that's totally inconsistent. That is what actually challenges the underroots of the EU, because it tells certain countries that because they're not as powerful, they're not as important. We said that we reduce that gap at the point at which we can no longer threaten each other, and more so that we can threaten other large federations of states with the kind of power that we could have, because it is potential power at the moment. Unless we collectivise, will only ever be potential power. It is better for all of us in the EU to do things on a long-term scale, on a large scale. We say that is the things that the EU is best at. Large policy, stuff like agriculture, stuff like oil nationalisation, okay? So for those reasons, we're delighted to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to close down the first half of this debate, and welcome to Deputy Director.
government's case is essentially this. Either firstly, we will have better mechanisms in order to produce more oil, or secondly, or secondly, that we will better be able to equitably distribute that oil. What I'm going to show you in my substantive is the incentives that the larger power-playing and oil-producing countries have at the point where you have this policy, why they are incentivised to either leave the EU, meaning you have less oil to distribute, or secondly, why the only way that the EU can guarantee their membership is if you have terms in which case nothing really changes and they continue to have all that oil. Before I do, 3 points of rebuttal. Firstly, I want to point out that the vast majority of opening government's cases I was given by the Prime Minister, that is to say, energy security for their domestic interests and less reliance on international, other bodies that also produce oil that they can export, or import, is, as Stephen points out, completely contingent on them proving that the EU has more oil and actually maintains and produces more oil. As we have already pointed out, as I will continue to point out, that will not be the case. Secondly, in responding to closing government, they say the problem is that the EDF controls a whole host, and there's a total monopoly, which means that you don't produce that much oil. A few responses to this. Firstly, we accept that market forces might not be completely perfect, right? We understand that. The problem is that one, it's much easier to blame a company, as Stephen points out, and not blame the EU as a political body, which means you're more likely to have these smaller countries leave. But secondly, we are more than happy for the EU, as opening governments say, to have some kind of quotas and to in some instances break up monopolies of companies like the EDF. What we don't have, or what we don't support, is the absolute oversight and control, production, manufacturing and distribution of that. Even if Helen tried to say, yes, we'll still be at the state level, she said, and in order for this motion to function, to have all the benefits that they said, the EU will in some way still have control of that. Thirdly, the big point, no thanks Adam, of the Deputy Prime Minister's speech was to say, yes, but it's totally consistent with the EU because we have all of these quotas and agricultural policies and milk policies. A few responses on this. Firstly, that is very different. It is very different for a number of reasons insofar as there are rare occurrences where the policy will intersect with the domestic policies which said you have to stop production. It's not an actual physical ownership and complete control over that production. It's certainly perceived different to the far-right anti-EU parties, as I will explain. But more importantly, secondly, we dispute to the extent that those policies have worked anyway. We think at the point we have massive butter mountains and huge lakes of milk, which is screwed over the third world, something which goes hugely against what we believe the principle to the EUB. They didn't provide enough analysis to say why that's good. I don't need to give you the analysis as to why it's objectively bad. I just need to give you enough analysis to say that it's not objectively good. Thirdly, they missed the point when he says, yes, smaller countries will now go to Angola. No. What Stephen said was that given that there's less incentive for the smaller countries to stay in the EU because there's a huge amount of nationalism and far-right nationalism that you give to these parties and smaller parties, now all of that thing that they are claiming to their people becomes true. That means that they are more likely to leave the EU and deal and trade with individuals who we don't want them to. Yes, it might not now be in their interest, but it will be at the point where you don't get all of the benefits that Stephen explained that they get. Firstly then, no thanks, point of substantive. Large oil and gas producers. These are hugely important in this debate that we're talking about. Why? Because they are the main suppliers of the gas and oil which these guys are trying to say will be distributed more, or higher production and more equitably. But secondly, we point out that they just have lots of revenue, even if it's not oil, right? Insofar as they have lots of other things that they can trade. What are the incentives of these countries? No thanks. Three things I want to look at. Firstly, the United Kingdom. There are two competing interests that the United Kingdom have. Firstly, they have Nigel Farage and the United Kingdom Independence Party, who won the EU elections. I know because I cried. The problem here, right, is that they have won on a platform by saying the EU is taking stuff away from us. We spend X amount of millions of pounds a day. This is horrible and atrocious. More than that, because we live there, Scotland is voting on independence. One of the main ways that the United Kingdom is guaranteeing the Scottish membership of the United Kingdom is saying, look, no, it's okay, you can still have control of your oil. You can still have control of that oil, you'll still see the benefit of that. If we go independent, I guarantee you we will not stay in the EU. And even if we don't go independent, the UK will have made those promises to us, and they will have to. It will be political suicide if they stay in the EU, given that they made those promises. The third country, or the second country, is Norway. Now, they're not that anti-EU, right? But given that they didn't agree to the common currency, we are more than happy to suggest that they are more than likely to just say, you know what, we can go it on our own like their neighbours. That is hugely problematic given that they are a huge oil producer. So what is the end result of this policy? In fact, before I go on, I'll take Adam.
If the EU manages to decrease people's energy bills, making it cheaper for them to heat their house in the winter and drive to work, won't that make people like the EU more?
No, because I factually dispute that. Because if opening government are true insofar as saying, yes, well, it's going to be really equity distributed, that means the United Kingdom are going to go, well, we're not getting the benefit of our oil prices rise, they then leave the EU, then that means there's less oil to be shared. Now, opening government are right to suggest that there are benefits, no thanks, Helen, of actually staying within the EU. That is to say, you have huge, influence in your ability to control policies that are for your interests. It's much easier to deal and trade, and you have much more control over manufacturing policies. The problem here is that that's true under the status quo. That is stuff that has to be weighed up against the fact that there are negatives from being in the EU. The fact that you don't have control over certain parts of your industries, the fact that you are, in my opinion, quite rightly giving a lot of money to poor countries. The problem here is that calculus changes now, right? Because they're right, it's great to be in the EU, but it no longer, when you weigh up the comparative now, because you have huge amounts, no thanks, of your oil revenue being controlled by other individuals. So even if it doesn't get distributed away from you, you feel like it is. But secondly, in order for their case to work, to say that you are better outcomes for these smaller countries, you have to necessarily take it away from these oil producers. That then means that that calculation becomes much more likely to leave the EU. So either they leave the EU and you do not get enough oil to be able to distribute, and obviously the harms of that are relatively intuitive, because now even if they can prove that you can distribute it more fairly, there's now not enough oil to do it. But secondly, the softer case, the other alternative. So the EU goes, oh my Christ, the UK and Norway are seriously lobbying us to leave. Now what they do is they say, right, okay guys, you can stay in. It becomes a soft prop. They say, right, well, you can still have some control over it. We'll give you really good terms. We'll still give you most of the oil that you have. Now what happens? We doubt that it will be shared equitably. We doubt that the smaller countries, the opening government and closing government want to say we'll gain all the benefits, will get the benefits, because the EU have to make political promises to these countries. What happens now? All of the harms that Stephen outlines in relation to smaller countries leaving the EU now because they are not getting the benefit the opening government and the rest of the government bent promises. So what happened by the end of the debate? Firstly, we dispute the fact that it will be shared equitably because of all of the political incentive that Stephen gave you. Secondly, insofar as it's not, the backlash from smaller countries with far-right nationalism will be huge. Bigger oil producers will either leave or stay there to have guaranteed good terms. This isn't like other EU common economic policies. For these reasons, we are incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Moving forward to the second half of the debate.
Mr. Speaker, what we've had thus far on top half is a good general debate about why something should be done at an EU level and why this is beneficial. Right? We think opening government clearly won this. It's funny Joe tried to make it about Scottish independence. What we're going to do in closing half is give some real nuance and some real detail on the European energy market in two areas. The predominance of monopolies and why those monopolies exist and why we get rid of those monopolies and the enormous benefits of that, right? Specifically clashing with this stuff about it's going to be terrible and therefore we'll leave the EU. And secondly about liquefied natural gas, something which hasn't been touched on in this debate and is absolutely crucial, right? People are just saying like oil and gas if they're the same. No, the LNG market has a very specific formation and that makes our case far more likely to happen, right? Like Matt knows loads of stuff about this, I'm really lucky. So, let's introduce two things right away because all my rebuttal is going to be interwoven and I will flag it as I get to it, right? Firstly, monopolies, right? The EDF, we mentioned previously, own all of the energy infrastructure in France, most of it in England and most of it in Germany as well. There is a clear monopoly here. This is not something we're asserting, but something that luckily, Joe just says in front of my POI, we'll break them up. We're trying to do that right now. The European Competition Commission in 2011 and 2007, under Articles 106, 107 and 108 of their particular founding legislation, have tried to do this and have failed. This is because there is a particular margin of appreciation with organisations like the Competition Commission, which means that they can't force these countries to break up these monopolies for all the reasons that they've talked about. EDF is not an isolated example. There is a reason energy markets tend towards monopoly. That's because there are massive upfront infrastructure costs in order to get these built. If you build a nuclear power plant somewhere, some like lucky go-for-it capitalist isn't going to build one next door. This means there is a preponderance of large companies. Why is this bad? Because when you have monopolies, they have incredibly high prices. They can have whatever profits they want in as much as there is no choice for the consumer, whether that be at the individual level or for the state, and you can't capture those savings for the individual. Right? This is why all their stuff about competition and choice goes away. You don't get choice as an individual or as someone bargaining to get a better contract when there are these large monopolies, right? Why are high prices so important in this debate? 3 reasons. Firstly, because there are individuals freezing in the winter around Europe in as much as they are unable to afford their energy bills. Joe, this is true. Like, this is particularly something you bleeding hard liberals care about, right? Like, there is a problem when people are dying. Like, obviously a problem when people are dying in this country so they can't afford their energy bills. Secondly, it chokes off an economic recovery. When fuel is incredibly expensive because large monopolies have incentives to put profit instead of lower prices, you get a poor economic recovery in an economy which is hugely reliant on energy. And thirdly, you warp the effect on politics, right? There is a reason that France are willing to sell warships to Russia because they're enormously reliant on their liquefied natural gas going to them. Why is this important? Right? All of these things, three things, are clearly important in and of themselves, in as much as you can then decrease prices because you break up these monopolies, it's nationalised. Yes, you do decrease, this is like Joe's POR response, where he says, but you're going to take money away from these countries. No. What opening government clearly says is that you take money away from the companies that are doing this, and there may be a hit to GDP in some way, right? At no point did they say we give this to like countries per capita, right? This isn't a radical redistribution, it's a more equitable one, right? There's a nuanced difference there. But importantly, if there is a hit to GDP, there is a massive comparative decrease in prices that individuals are paying for their fuel. This means their heating bills will go down, like cost of living, an issue that's enormously important in Western liberal democracies, and one of the reasons that actually socially democratic governments have taken huge hits at local elections, right? Because they're not seen to be delivering on cost of living. Why does this clash enormously with all of their, like, if this is about, I don't know, pulling out the EU, which is not, but let's say it is, right? Let's say it is. This is how you actually massively increase the future buying of the EU, because the EU, individuals can point at an EU institution which is having a direct benefit for their lives. There was a problem before in the UK, in France, and loads of other countries. People point to these institutions and say, this market is not working. We are being damaged by the fact there are these monopolies, and no one can do something because these companies are bigger than the countries in which they operate. The EU, as a larger institution, has the ability to break up these monopolies and deliver savings for people living in the EU. People don't vote on countries' energy policy. They vote on the way that energy policy impacts them as individuals, right, through cost of living. We affect that far more, and therefore we need massive improvements. Joe.
There is a funny amount of oil. Either you're saying that you're giving smaller, poorer countries more oil, in which case you'll have some kind of price rise in richer countries. You can't guarantee that everyone's going to have a lower price. You have to pick one.
No, because it's a national monopoly and therefore it can control price itself, right, because it's not due to market forces. What we would say is in terms of smaller countries, we're fine even if the distribution was the same as it was at the moment, right, in terms of how much they have. You can say that we're willing to charge them less for it in as much as we're going to take away their profits, right? They are paying less for oil, right? But let's actually deal specifically with this idea that there's a finite amount of oil, because it's really funny that everyone's chatting about oil, because like oil's old news, guys. Liquefied natural gas, right? We're going to talk about this in our second point, right? So monopolies there, monopolies happen, prices go down, that's good. EU, we're not going to leave it, screw Farage. Second point, liquefied natural gas, right? We are moving away from oil and nuclear, right? For all the reasons that have been given thus far, right? Like a turbulent Middle East, we can't ensure these things. Japan have moved away from nuclear energy as well, in as much as there were natural disasters there. And they're all going for one option. That's liquefied natural gas. That's because once it's cheaper in the long term. Actually transporting it and using it is cheaper, like refining it, it's a cleaner source of energy. And also most of the countries that produce it are often more stable. Australia have an enormous production of liquefied natural gas. The UK may well potentially as well in terms of fracking. Why aren't we doing this at the moment then, right? Why is liquefied natural gas something that's odd? Because there are enormous upfront infrastructure costs, right? In terms of deep sea ports, in terms of tunnel systems that need to be produced in order to transport the liquefied natural gas, enormous upfront infrastructure costs. This means that the only player able to, and the only player that is producing infrastructure for liquefied natural gas in mainland Europe is Russia, in as much as no individual country within the EU has the ability or individual company has the incentive to produce this massive infrastructure. This is specifically, right, in terms of a mechanism for the stuff OG talked about, how Russia are keeping chokeholds on other countries, because they are the only people able to transport this liquefied natural gas, because they're the only people willing to pay these upfront high infrastructure costs. What happens when the EU then is unable to fund this liquefied natural gas and is unable to pay for it? Firstly, as I've given you in all my previous harms, because liquefied natural gas would be a cheaper option, if you are able to build the infrastructure for that, pooling all of the resources and solving the collective action problem that exists at the moment, you get cheaper fuel for individuals living in Europe. You get the benefits I talked about previously. You get a stronger economy, and as much as fuel costs less. And this response, you're like, there's only a finite amount of oil. There's a lot of liquefied natural gas, which you can't get it at the moment. We give you a mechanism to get it, right? So like, even if you're right, you're wrong. So that's how we do it, right? So in terms of it being cheaper, you get that. But secondly, and probably quite importantly in this debate, you're less reliant on Russia, right? Because the countries, as I mentioned previously, you're getting liquefied natural gas from are more stable. These are countries like Australia, which are able to invest enormously in liquefied natural gas only because they get 15-year contracts from Japan after they move away from nuclear energy, only because they have the assurance that that money is coming. You provide that assurance when you have a nationalised framework at the EU level. Mr. Speaker, this debate clearly wasn't just about like broad collective action problems, but why specifically in terms of the energy market and the monopolies that exist there and the transition that needs to occur to liquefied natural gas in order to decrease our reliance on Russia and get cheaper energy sources in the future. This is something that should be done in this specific market at this specific time. Mr. Speaker, this is not a debate about Scottish independence. It's probably far more one about liquefied natural gas and far more about energy market monopolies. For these reasons, I urge you to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now welcome to the
Mr. Speaker, on closing, we'll give you a lot of reasons as to why nationalization is generally bad. But most importantly, and this is where we will expand the debate, that even if oil and natural gas resources should be nationalized, it's much better if they stay in control of nation states in Europe. Before that, a lot of rebuttal. So one, opening tells us that they're more likely to source it, that countries are now more likely to buy oil and gas from the EU. Several problems with this. One, as already pointed out, the EU is a net importer of gas. But two, even if they have like a economy of scale, the biggest issue is that countries like Angola and a lot of other OPEC countries have a huge advantage. That is that they don't have to care about environmental issues, which effectively make the production of oil and gas far more expensive. So even if imports are marginally more expensive from OPEC countries, because of political costs and the long time it will take to make these decisions, and because precisely of the environmental policies and issues with that, no thank you, which they point out, that gas will be far more expensive to produce. So, then they tell us, well, this is in the common interest of the EU. Not necessarily. Some countries in the EU are exporters, some are importers. Necessarily, some of them will be harmed. Some have an interest in gas and oil prices remaining high. Others have interest in them getting lower, as is also pointed out by closing up. So there is no common interest. Two, if you want them to develop their gas and natural resources more, they can do that far better if they remain in hands of national countries. We'll explain that in our extension. Lastly, they tell us, yes, but all the arguments we give are generally arguments against EU economic integration. Recognize how the first speech talks about how oil and gas are important because they lead to money, which leads to power. A lot of countries which are rich in these kinds of resources base their whole development on that, which is precisely where the distinction lies. Moreover, things like the CAP were strongly criticized by a lot of countries, and this will be even more because this is even more important. Then closing comes up, and they tell us, well, we have monopolies, and we fail to break them up. Okay, try it again. You can't just assert that you can make this policy go through, but we can't break up monopolies. On a comparative, we think that in the real world, this policy would be far harder to enact than just breaking up some monopolies. No, thank you. Two, if that's your issue, then if your issue is that some companies hold monopolies, then nationalize those companies, but keep them in the hands of nation states in Europe. That will solve your problem of big companies having monopolies. Do they tell us, yes, but now we have big prices. Okay, and you just assert that an EU energy agency will necessarily reduce those prices once we nationalize them. We don't think that will happen. A lot of countries which have an interest in EU exporting oil will just have a tendency to keep the prices slightly lower than the basic world price because they can gain more money from exports. Then we don't think that this will necessarily happen. Moreover, if you give cheap oil and gas to your own citizens, that means that you lose on oil and gas you could possibly export, so you don't get the economic benefits you're talking about. We think that the analysis that prices will now just get lower is completely assertive. We see no reason why this energy agency should act in such a way. Lastly, they talk about liquid natural gas and how it takes long term, how it's very expensive to produce it in the long run. One, if there are realistic possibilities that you can have LNG, then you can often take long-term loans and then pay them back. You can also give concessions to companies to develop your LNG capacities in countries. Two, the reason why you don't have LNG production is not always because of the lack of resources. It is often because the technology which creates LNG, fracking, is something which is very unpopular in the local areas, which means the local populations are often very, very much against it. Precisely as is happening in Romania, which has the resources to make LNG production, but because people are against it, they often hold referendums. Now, if you want to just bypass those people, one, why not do it through nation states? They can more easily accept that through national countries than to the EU. But secondly, as was already pointed out, that only increases the Euroscepticism which already exists. And three, and most importantly, considering that this energy agency will have to take into account views of a lot of EU countries, as pointed out by OG, it will be far harder to make a decision to start this production, especially because you have groups with competing interests in the EU. So if you want LNG production, it's far easier for it to happen if nation states decide on it. Why is nationalization generally bad? Because we think that industries won't if we think that a market, when there is no competition, has less incentive to improve itself. We also think that often people who work within these institutions have their own personal interests, be that increasing of work, be it working in the interest of certain member states, like those who are net exporters of gas and oil. No, thank you. So, what do we tell you here? We tell you that even if nationalization is good, and we gave you reasons as to why it is not, it is better if it is done by national states. Why? So if their problem is that the EU often doesn't have a mutual policy, they already make those decisions. Yeah, go. Closing.
With a nationalised industry, the profit percentage to shareholders doesn't exist, and they can massively control and decrease prices. That's just the benefit of nationalisation, or are you conceding nationalisation is good?
Not necessarily, because if it is nationalized by an EU institution and the ownership goes to an EU institution, that committee can have a completely different interest, or the interest that works in the interest of some countries but not of others. So why is this good for individual countries if they do nationalize? Just on that point, because no, thank you. States have a bigger incentive to develop their production in comparison to an EU agency. Why? Because the amount of money that will go to that country, which increases its oil and gas production, will be much bigger. Why? Because in the status quo, if they implement this policy, countries don't have that big an incentive to agree. So it's more likely that you will have people protesting against it. It's more likely that you will have that government trying to block creation of oil and gas extraction resources on its territory. Why? Because a far smaller amount of profits will go to it. On a comparative, if you nationalize that, those states have a bigger incentive to build production capacities, if they so exist, and export elsewhere, because the profits that go to them in the long run are far bigger. Fracking is already a huge issue precisely because of environmental concerns and because it creates harms for the local population, even if it is beneficial overall. If you expand the benefits to the EU, those people get even less, which means that both those people and local communities as well as countries will be far less supportive of this. But even if all of that's not true, the EU has a very small amount of oil and natural resources, and we don't think that this policy can simply help it improve integration. Very proud to oppose.
Mr. Speaker, energy markets are international, and if the previous speaker doesn't think that the EU has enough oil and gas to produce its own sustainable energy market, neither do the monopolised companies within it. We always have to be dealing on an international scale when we negotiate energy prices. We do that better as a collective. 2 points today in summation. First of all, foreign policy. How does this strengthen the EU on the foreign stage? How does this then strengthen support for the EU from within? Secondly, internal EU politics. How do we actually reduce the cost of living for individuals? How do we increase buy-in to the EU? Before that, however, 3 points of rebuttal. First of all, liquefied natural gas. He says that national companies or nationalist governments should just take out really long loans. Notice that after 2008, interest rates on really long loans aren't great, especially for national governments in Western Europe. Rather, it's much better if we do this together. Secondly, he says fracking isn't popular. Fracking is the problem, right? Because we can't import gas at the moment from places where they aren't fracking. We wouldn't have to be fracking if we were able to build deep-sea ports in Europe and fund the tankers required to move liquefied natural gas from Australia and Canada, where they have built huge LNG plants to satisfy Japanese demand after the Fukushima disaster. If we were able to bring it in, we wouldn't have to have the fracking in the first place. We could have big posters up saying EU stop fracking in your area. That would be great for EU buy-in. Second point, nationalism, he says, is generally bad. But see Adam's extension, right? His alternative is some wonderful pluralistic competitive marketplace. That's not possible when infrastructure costs are so incredibly high. You don't have two sets of power lines going along next to each other, competing for who can provide the best price. It's simply not sustainable to do that. It tends to monopoly always. The monopoly we provide is one which gives collective political bargaining power to the people, not just lots and lots of money to anonymous shareholders. Finally, a little bit of a contradiction here. He says, wouldn't non-nationalised companies be great? Oh wait, maybe we should just nationalise. I'll focus on the second point now. He said that they should stay national. But notice we lose all foreign policy power at the point Russia is just able to play us off against each other and say, "Oi, Serbia will give you cheaper prices than we are giving to the French." At the point at which we have a closed shop on energy and go, "No, you have to provide all of Europe with a decent price." We are, first of all, we are buying more gas, so we're able to negotiate a better price, and secondly, we can actually impose sanctions because people like Germany and France over the Ukraine crisis can't say, "No, we can't risk our own national energy markets here." Secondly, it's an international market, right? It's an inter-Europe market. You require inter-Europe infrastructure. There's no point in having a power line going up to a border and then turning right back round again. Having central planning is incredibly important if you're going to provide energy across the entirety of Europe. To move surpluses from France to a higher demand in Scotland. Or notice social justice demands, right? If poorer countries aren't able to provide the energy for their people, then you can move that from surpluses elsewhere. We can provide the social justice needs when we nationalise it. Cool. First point, foreign policy. Yeah, go on then.
You can't simultaneously claim that you're going to send more oil to poorer countries and keep the richer oil-producing countries in by having lower prices. You have to accept there's a finite amount of oil, and if you do that, oil and gas becomes an extortionate actual good to produce, in which case you have much more economic balance.
The thing is, yeah, you know what, there is a finite amount of oil and gas, but we are able to get more of that finite amount of oil and gas when we are able to bring in oil and gas from places like Australia and Canada using liquefied natural gas plants which we are now able to afford. We have more access to more cheap energy at the point at which we're able to do this. And yes, therefore, and also, Joe's point here, right, about, oh, Scotland gets really, really upset about the idea of Europe controlling its oil and gas. No, all that money coming goes to France from the EDF, right? Scotland don't get all the revenue from their oil and gas after Maggie Thatcher sold it off. Private companies get that money. Come on, right, so foreign policy. Under the status quo, right, we are currently beholden to Russia. We are unable to impose sanctions over Ukraine because Germany and France say, no, we cannot risk our national energy markets. France continue to sell warships to Russia because they say, no, we cannot risk our national energy markets. What we need, therefore, is a viable alternative. What we also need is collective bargaining power, right? We need the ability to say that we can, we will all put on this boycott together. Notice that Russia is able to push watermark, thus always making it worse and worse and worse for people within Europe. Secondly, right, so what's our viable alternative? We show you that the liquefied natural gas market is currently wide open. Australia and Canada are responding to long-term Japanese demand, which looking for 15-year contracts. There's a lot of liquefied natural gas in incredibly stable countries which is being produced. The upfront production costs have been met. The upfront transport costs haven't. EDF doesn't want to do this because it would threaten their nuclear power plants they put so much money into, and national governments don't have enough money to put forward these huge loans to the deep sea ports, these huge loans to actually freeze the gas and then transport it across. We say that Europe does because there'll just be more money in the pot, right? Because we'll have all of the proceeds from the European energy market, which Open Gov talked about, suddenly in one big pot which we're able to use to bring this liquefied natural gas in from elsewhere. What does that mean? That means we finally actually have a viable alternative. No longer are we actually beholden to Russia completely. No longer do we have to go, if we want to make a political standpoint, we have to accept that energy prices will go up and old poor people will die, but rather we go, no, screw it, we've already got liquefied natural gas, we're fine. Right then, how does this affect internal EU politics? Because OO tell you that national economies have a better bargaining power when they're on their own, that therefore their economies do better on their own, and therefore everyone will leave the EU as soon as we combine. OG show you that first of all we get more bargaining power when we actually have a collective action through the closed shop. Secondly, they also give you a whole load of other reasons why people aren't just going to up sticks and leave the EU, because they're suddenly worried that now the EU's getting the money and not EDF. People aren't particularly concerned about that. We show you, however, in closing, 5 things. First of all, we show you that monopolies keep prices high as they are. Secondly, we show you that energy always tends to monopoly because you can't have competition over infrastructure. Thirdly, we show you that Russia pushes the prices up because we have a low bargaining power and then the monopolies keep them at the high watermark, thus making our prices incredibly high. 4, start-up costs for viable alternatives are incredibly high, and we can provide that through the European Union. And 5, therefore we can negotiate long-term lower prices. That's good for both foreign policy and for our domestic internal objectives. Therefore, therefore people buy into the EU more. Like, first of all, because they're providing them with cheaper energy, and that's good. But also because people want power. If Joe wants to talk about the No campaign, right, for example in Scotland, one of the most powerful arguments is to say you have more power when you are in the UK. If suddenly people look at the EU and notice the EU is actually standing up to Russia and able to provide things for its citizens, not beholden to Gazprom, not beholden to Putin, and say, look, as the part of the EU, you can stand up to Putin, you can maintain a good cost of living, that's great. That's good for domestic interests. So because people get cheaper energy, because you have more power from Russia, and because the EU is then able to deliver on its promises of prosperity and power. For all these reasons, very proud to propose.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I'm going to summarize this debate through a couple of questions. Number one, why we think that general nationalization is bad. Number two, what's the issues with EU control and Euroscepticism. And number three, why we think that even if nationalization is actually good, why we think that the states will be more driven to produce more, therefore to have cheaper prices if the producement of all of this stays there. Before that, a couple of points of rebuttal. Two reasons why we think that prices won't be cheaper. Number one, if they have to divide the profit within all European countries, which was a plan by opening government, in that particular situation, they will need much more money. In that particular situation, prices cannot go down because they need more money, so more states can actually get the money. Number two, we think that the European Union and institutions of European Union so far have showed that very often they have their own interests. They're trying to gather money from themselves. Therefore, sometimes we think they will also try to make benefits for themselves. Therefore, they do not have an incentive to make prices smaller because they want some money to also go to those institutions so they can be more powerful, so they can be more influential. Number two, they're talking about deep sea ports. We do not have a problem with that because those are not oil and gas resources. Therefore, if they want to do that, we're completely fine with that as closing opposition. Number three, they're also talking about Australia and United States of America. We want to tell you that both Australia and United States of America have much more oil and gas resources than European Union. Therefore, A, we can never be their competition because they have much more resources than European Union. But two, if you cannot be competitive on that market, that means your bargaining chip is also smaller than the government is trying to represent here today. Because if we cannot compete with you, then we cannot make the conditions. How do you need to behave and what do you need to do, because we don't have anything to actually offer to you because you have more than we do. Also, the fourth thing is that Scotland wants to get out of United Kingdom exactly because of oil, because they think that United Kingdom is benefiting on their oil too much. Why don't you see that the same thing can happen with United Kingdom or any other state within the European Union? Why do we think that any national state will agree upon the fact to give their own resources and then not to get the profit from that? We think that's going to be huge de-incentive for them to efficiently produce, to make smaller prices and to try earn the profit, because they're aware of the fact that no matter what they do, the profit is not going to go to them, the profit is going to go to the other states, and European Union will randomly decide how and where. Why nationalization is bad? Number one, we think that it's less efficient. We think that competition gets much smaller. We think that you don't have that incentive that individual has in order to get the profit, because state companies function differently than private companies that are actually competing between each other, which one is going to be more successful, which is going to have smaller prices, etc. Number two, we think that the issue is also with the competition. Once you introduce nationalization, that means that the state is always going to give benefits to that particular company. That means that multinational companies from other states will not be interested to come in our states and trade with us anymore. Therefore, we think that the prices actually will not get cheaper and not get smaller, because other companies will not enter our state, because national company will be in a beneficial position. Therefore, you will not have the competitions between cheaper prices. But okay, let's even accept the fact that nationalization is good. But let me tell you why, even if nationalization is good, things should stay within national state rather than European Union. Number one, we have huge problem with control of European Union. Firstly, we do not think that the European Union nor its institutions are always neutral. We've seen that with ECB acting in a way that is very good for Germany and not acting in a way which is very good for any other state. We think that is the exactly same thing that is going to happen. We think that might cause smaller countries to be in a less beneficial position than the other countries. Number two, we think that it's much harder to control European Union institutions than it is to control your own state and your own company. Once you think your national company is actually doing very bad, you can go to the elections and you can actually change your government, change the policies, change the way that functions. We think that influence that you can have on elections within European Union and people who are going to govern it is much smaller. Yeah, we vote for European Parliament, but let's face it, European Parliament is 10 times less powerful than any other institution, such as, for example, Council. Therefore, we think that it's much harder to control those kind of institutions. Number three, we think that European Union, as I already said, they have their own interests. They often want to do something so their institution can be more powerful. They often want to do something so they can gather more countries and get more profits for themselves. We've seen with European Court of Justice constantly trying to get bigger power, bigger influence, and bigger possibilities. Therefore, we think that those institutions sometimes might work in their own interest rather than working in anyone else. Yes?
Okay, so the EU bargaining chip is bigger than the German bargaining chip. Why do marginal losses of national interest, just like what happens in the
I'm getting to that. I'm getting to that. The issue with Germany is that, or any other country within European Union, is that they're not going to be interested to be as productive as they were before. Why? Firstly, you already have a narrative within the society that people are taking their jobs, that European Union is inefficient. You have FN winning elections, you have UKIP winning elections, you have Euroscepticism rising all the time and people being against European Union. Why? Because they think that if their country is rich with something, European Union comes, takes it and gives it to the other. They don't see that as justified. The same thing is going to happen exactly right now. Once people people do realize that they're taking my oil and they're taking my gas. I can make profit from that, but rather than that, the European Union thinks that it's much better to do it in the other way. So what do we think? We're going to face a situation that goes as follows. A, smaller countries are not going to be satisfied because European institutions will very often not work in a neutral way. But number two, even though they will sometimes work in the interest of the rich countries, that's still not going to be enough to satisfy those rich countries, because they will be aware of the fact I could have got more money if the company was in my state, if the company was working only for the interest of my state, rather than working for the interest of many other states. Exactly because of this narrative, we think that not even anyone is going to be as interested as it is right now to stay within the European Union, because in the end, both sides will lose. Why do we think that actually it's much better that the company should stay within their own state? If the company stays in the national state and does not go to the European Union, we do see that their production will be efficient much more than it is if it goes to the European Union. Why? Because you will get all the money for yourself. Then you will be able to divide that money within your country in the particular way you want it to be divided. Then you will also have huge incentive to invest that money in further production and in making prices smaller, so you can, out of order, so you can actually get the benefits for yourself, so you can invest more in the production, so your production can be more efficient, so you can in the end get more money for yourself and for your interest. We think that that motivation, self-interest, is the biggest motivation in today's society, Mr. Speaker. We think that is exactly the thing that is going to drive the countries to be more efficient, because they will know how much I work, how productive I am, I will get as many as I've deserved. Not the other way around. I work a lot and then someone else gets something. What does closing opposition bring to you today, Mr. Speaker? We bring to you that we think that generally nationalization makes companies less efficient, less good, and that generally the outcome is much worse. But then we accepted that maybe nationalization can be good. But then we make a comparative with the national companies staying in the state and going to the European Union, because we think that we have huge issues with Euroscepticism, but more importantly, because we think that we have huge issues with controlling European Union, and thirdly, because we think that we have huge issue with states staying motivated to continue to produce once they know the profit doesn't go to them. We're strongly proud to oppose the motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for this vote.